The bell above the door barely made a sound. It was the kind of chime that had greeted 10,000 strangers over 12 years, rusted and thin, more habit than announcement. But on this Tuesday afternoon in November, that small metallic clink carried the weight of everything that was about to change. The boy stood in the doorway like something the storm had dragged in and forgotten.
All right,
10
listen
years
up.
old,
We move on my
soaking wet.
mark.
Are
His
we ready?
sneakers squelched
We're
against
ready.
the
Stay
linoleum,
close.
leaving dark puddles with every step. His jacket, 2 sizes too big, hung from his shoulders like a flag at half-mast.
There you go, champ.
His
Come
hair
and
was
get it.
plastered to his forehead,
Wow, thanks.
and
It's so
beneath it,
cool.
a pair
You
of
earned
eyes
it,
that
kid.
no child should ever have. Old eyes. Eyes that had seen the kind of things that age a person decades in
Where did you
months.
get that
He
tooth?
walked to the counter with
fell
the
out of my
careful,
mouth.
deliberate steps
Fell
of
out? Let
someone
me
who
see.
had rehearsed this moment. His small hands reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper, damp and crumpled at the edges. He placed it on the glass countertop with the precision of a man presenting his last piece of collateral. "Sir," his voice was barely above a whisper, "please, can this buy protection?" Dean Hargrove, the man behind the counter, the man the world knew as Rattler, did not move. He stood there with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a half-assembled watch spread across his work mat, and he looked at the boy the way you look at something that stops your heart. The tissue paper was unfolded carefully. Inside was a tooth, gold crown, smeared with dried blood that had turned the color of rust. The root was still attached, ragged and torn, ripped from a jaw by force and not by any dentist's hand. Rattler had seen plenty of strange things walk through the door of his pawn shop. Engagement rings from marriages that ended in screaming. Guitars from musicians who chose the needle over the note. Military medals from men who decided their service meant less than a bottle. But he had never seen a child place a bloody tooth on his counter and ask for a weapon. The boy's hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from something deeper, something that lived in the bones. "It's my mom's tooth," the boy said. "Her boyfriend knocked it out. He's the police chief. He's going to kill her Thursday. I can't call the police because he is the police. I tried everything. Nobody helps, so I need a gun. I'll use it Thursday when he comes back. I know I'll go to jail. That's okay, my mom will be alive. That's all that matters." The boy reached into his other pocket, quarters, dimes, pennies, a few crumpled dollar bills. He spread them on the counter next to the tooth. $347. Everything he had, everything a 10-year-old could scrape together, from birthday money and odd jobs and the change jar his mother kept on top of the refrigerator. "Please, is it enough?" Rattler took one step back from the counter. Not from fear, from the wave of something that crashed through him so hard he thought his knees might buckle. Grief, recognition, the sensation of standing at the exact intersection of past and present, where the road forks in one direction leads to the same mistake you made 16 years ago, and the other direction leads to the thing you should have done then, but didn't. Because Rattler had heard the story before. Not these words, not this boy, not this town, but the shape of it, the architecture of desperation, the blueprint of a life being destroyed while the people who should stop it looked the other way. November 2008, 16 years ago. Rattler had been in Iraq clearing houses in Ramadi with the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines. The kind of work where you kicked in doors and prayed whatever was on the other side didn't kill you before you killed it. He was good at it, controlled, precise. The kind of Marine who kept his hands steady when others shook. The mail caught up with his unit on a Thursday. 3 weeks of letters bundled in rubber bands tossed into a pile for the platoon to sort through. Rattler found his near the bottom. One envelope, his mother's handwriting. He could tell something was wrong before he opened it because his mother always wrote long letters. 4 pages, 5 pages, updates about the garden and the neighbors, and who got married and who got divorced. This envelope was thin, 1 sheet. 3 sentences. "Your sister Jolene passed away. Her boyfriend. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." He read it 3 times, then a 4th. Then he walked behind the concrete blast wall where the platoon stored water bottles, sat in the dust with his back against the rough concrete and his sister's death notice in his hands. And he cried in a way he had never cried before. Not the clean tears of sadness. The ugly, convulsive sobbing of a man who understands with sudden and total clarity that the most important person in his world had died while he was looking the other direction. His squad leader found him there 20 minutes later. Didn't say a word, just sat down beside him in the dust and waited. Jolene, 26 years old, waitress at a truck stop outside Richmond, a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that made strangers feel like old friends. She had called Rattler 6 months before he deployed, her voice shaking on the satellite phone, cutting in and out through static and distance. "Ray, I think Derek's getting worse. He grabbed my arm so hard it left marks, but he apologized. He said it won't happen again." Rattler had been preparing for deployment. His mind was in Ambar province in the sand, in the briefings about IED patterns and insurgent movement. He was distracted, focused on surviving the next 12 months. He told her the thing that people say when they don't have time to truly listen. "If it happens again, call the police. I'll deal with it when I get back." It happened again, and again, and again. Jolene called the police twice. Both times Derek was calm when officers arrived. Charming even. Explained it away with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that a steady voice and a firm handshake could erase bruises from the official record. Domestic dispute. She fell. Misunderstanding. Officers filed reports and left. The third time Jolene tried to call Derek, ripped the phone from her hand and smashed it against the wall. Then he smashed her face against the kitchen counter. 17 times, the medical examiner counted 17 distinct impact points on her skull. By the time Rattler got emergency leave and made it back to Virginia, Jolene had been in the ground for 2 weeks. Her casket stayed closed at the funeral. The damage was too severe for viewing. Derek got 15 years, out in 8 for good behavior. Rattler looked him up once after coming home from Iraq. Found where Derek was living, what he was doing. Spent 3 days sitting in his truck outside Derek's new apartment. Service pistol in the glove box. 3 days of imagining himself walking up those stairs, knocking on that door, doing what the law should have done and didn't. 3 days of watching Derek come and go from his job at a tire shop, watching him carry groceries, watching him live the ordinary life of a man who had beaten a woman to death and served 8 years and been released into a world that had already forgotten what he'd done. He never went up those stairs. Not because Derek didn't deserve what was waiting in that glove box. Because Jolene wouldn't have wanted her brother in a cage. She was the gentle one, the peacemaker, the one who saw good in everyone, even in the man who ended her, even impossibly in a world that had looked at her bruises and filed a report and moved on. So Rattler drove home, put the pistol in a lockbox in his closet, opened the pawn shop, joined the Hells Angels because they understood something that civilian life had failed to teach him, that loyalty isn't a feeling. It's an action. It's showing up. It's standing between danger and the people who can't protect themselves. And he waited. For 16 years, he waited without knowing what he was waiting for. 16 years of guilt. 16 years of the same thoughts circling like a vulture that never lands. I was protecting strangers in a desert while my baby sister was being destroyed at home. I should have been there. I should have stopped it. I should have saved her. And now, standing in his pawn shop at 3:23 on a Tuesday afternoon in November, Rattler was looking at Jolene. Not literally, but close enough to break him open. A child desperate, failed by every adult who should have protected them. Trying to solve an adult's violence with a child's logic. If I get a weapon, I can stop the danger. I can save the person I love. The same logic Rattler had used sitting in that truck with a pistol in the glove box. The same desperation, the same love twisted into something dangerous by a world that refused to help. His hands were shaking now. The same hands that had held dying Marines in Ramadi. The same hands that had carried Jolene's photograph in his wallet every single day for 16 years. The same hands that were about to do what he couldn't do for his sister. He stepped around the counter, knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "Son," his voice was rough, like gravel dragged across concrete. "What's your name?" Ethan Dawson." "Ethan, I'm Rattler. I'm going to tell you 3 things and I need you to listen to all of them. First, I'm not going to sell you a gun. You're too young, and more than that, you don't need one. You understand, you don't need to take anyone's life. You don't need to go to jail. You don't need to sacrifice yourself. That's not how this works." The boy's face crumpled. The dam broke. Tears streamed down his cheeks, cutting clean lines through the grime on his face. 10 years old, and he had been so brave for so long that when someone finally told him he didn't have to be, the relief nearly knocked him down. Second thing, Rattler pulled a bandana from his pocket and handed it to the boy. "Your mom's boyfriend, police chief, whoever he is, he's not going to touch your mother Thursday. He's not going to touch her tomorrow. He's not going to touch her ever again. Because as of right now, your family just got bigger." Rattler tapped the patch on his leather vest. The serpent wrapped around a skull. Virginia chapter stitched beneath it. This patch means I have 47 brothers in this town. When I tell them what you just told me, every single one of them is going to drop what they're doing and come. Not with violence, with presence, with protection, with the real law, not your mom's boyfriend's twisted version of it. But he is the police, Ethan whispered. He is the law. No, son, he's not. He is one man with a badge who's been abusing his power. There's a bigger law than him. It's called the FBI. And they love hearing about corrupt police chiefs. Rattler stood, walked back behind the counter, picked up the gold tooth, carefully wrapped it in the tissue paper, and handed it back to Ethan. Third thing, and this is important, this stops being your responsibility right now. You're 10 years old. You shouldn't be carrying this. You shouldn't be trying to fix this alone. That's what adults are for. The adults in your life failed you. Teachers, counselors, hospitals, courts, police. They all failed, but we won't. Then Rattler did something that surprised even himself. He removed his Hell's Angels patch from his vest. The same patch he had worn for 12 years. The patch that meant brotherhood, loyalty, protection above all else. He pinned it carefully to Ethan's torn jacket right over the boy's heart. You're wearing our colors now. That means you're protected. That means your mom is protected. That means Thursday never happens. Understand? Ethan stared at the patch on his chest, touched it with one finger, then looked up at Rattler. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Rattler thought of Jolene, of the phone call that came too late, of 16 years of guilt and a closed casket and a pistol in a glove box. Because a long time ago, someone needed help and I wasn't there. I'm here now, and I'm not making that mistake again. 3 miles east, in Unit 3B of Riverside Apartments, Grace Dawson sat at her kitchen table and stared at the front door. Ethan had been gone for 2 hours. She knew where he was going. She had not stopped him. This was the part that would keep her awake for years, the knowledge that she had watched her 10-year-old son walk out into the November rain with a plan that would have destroyed his life, and she had let him go. Not because she wanted him to succeed, because she was too broken to stop him. 2 broken ribs on her left side healing badly because she couldn't go to a hospital without Wade Prescott finding out. A black eye, 5 days old, yellowing at the edges. Strangulation marks on her neck hidden under a scarf that she wore even inside the apartment because looking at those bruises in the mirror made it too real. Her jaw ached where the gold tooth had been. The socket was still tender, still raw, still a reminder of Sunday night. Grace Dawson was 32 years old. She had been beautiful once, and she would be beautiful again, but right now she looked like something that had been put through a machine designed to break people down to their components, skin and bone and fear. She had not always been afraid. There was a time not long ago when Grace Dawson was the toughest woman in any room she entered. Not tough in the way that men use the word with fists and volume. Tough in the way that single mothers are tough, the quiet, relentless, bone-deep endurance of someone who works double shifts and still helps with homework and still makes sure the electricity stays on and still finds a way to smile at her son like the world isn't crushing her. She had dropped out of high school at 16 when her own mother died. Ovarian cancer stage 4 by the time they found it, gone in 3 months. Grace's father had left when she was 6. No siblings, no family. 16 years old alone, working the late shift at a gas station to pay rent on a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and cigarette smoke from the previous tenant. She met Ethan's father at 19. A boy, really. 20 years old and already committed to a life of disappearing. He was gone before Ethan could walk. No forwarding address. No child support, no goodbye. So Grace raised Ethan alone, waitressing at Riverside Diner where the tips were decent and the manager let her bring Ethan to the back booth during the dinner shift when she couldn't find a sitter. She was the kind of waitress customers remembered. Quick with a refill, genuine with a smile, the sort of person who made you feel like your Tuesday evening mattered. 8 years of this, 8 years of balancing a tray on one hand and a child on her hip with the other. 8 years of late-night math homework at the kitchen table with a calculator she borrowed from the library. 8 years of telling Ethan that his father loved him but had to go away, which was the kindest lie she could construct from the wreckage of abandonment. 8 years of being both parents, both incomes, both the soft place to land and the steel backbone that kept the whole structure standing. She was proud of that, quietly, fiercely proud, because Ethan was a good kid, smart, kind, The sort of boy who held the door for old women at the grocery store and shared his lunch with kids who forgot theirs. She had built that, not a man, not a system, her. Grace Dawson, high school dropout waitress, single mother architect of a small and decent life. Then 8 months ago, Wade Prescott walked into Riverside Diner for the first time. He was handsome, tall, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. Police chief's uniform pressed crisp badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He sat in Grace's section and ordered a steak medium rare and iced tea with no sugar. He left a $40 tip on a $22 meal and a note on the receipt. Best service I've had in years. I'll be back. He came back the next night, and the next, and the next. Always Grace's section, always the same order, always the same generous tip. He remembered things, asked about Ethan's spelling test, asked about Grace's day, listened in a way that no man had ever listened to her before with his full attention, like her words mattered, like she mattered. Within 2 weeks, he asked Grace to dinner. A real dinner, not at the diner. Somewhere with tablecloths and candles and a wine list that she didn't know how to read, but he navigated with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in rooms like this. He picked her up in a department-issued SUV that smelled like leather and authority. He held doors, pulled out her chair, complimented her dress, a $10 fine from a thrift store that she had spent an hour ironing until it looked like something from a catalog. He was everything Grace's life had been missing. Structure, dependability, the kind of man who called when he said he would and showed up when he said he would and followed through on promises with the same precision he brought to his job. Grace had spent a decade surrounded by absence. Absent father, absent boyfriend, absent support. Wade Prescott was the most present person she had ever known. He bought Ethan a baseball glove, took them both to a Nationals game, showed up at Ethan's school for Parents' Day when no father figure had ever shown up before. Grace watched her son light up around this man, this steady, uniformed, powerful man who represented everything they had never had. Stability, safety, presence. For 2 months, Grace allowed herself to believe that life was finally turning, that the years of exhaustion and loneliness and scraping by were ending, that someone had arrived who would share the weight. The first time Wade grabbed her arm, month 3, she told herself it was an accident. He had been stressed, a case at work. He had been drinking just 2 beers, but enough to sharpen the edge that she was only beginning to learn was always there beneath the surface. He apologized immediately, brought flowers the next morning, a bouquet of yellow roses that cost more than Grace made in a shift, held her gently, whispered into her hair that it would never happen again, that she was the best thing in his life, that he didn't know what came over him. Grace believed him because she needed to, because the alternative, admitting that the man she had allowed into her son's life, the man Ethan called Sir, and looked up to and wanted to impress, was dangerous, was too terrifying to face. So she filed it away. One incident. Everyone makes mistakes. He's stressed. He's sorry. It won't happen again. The second time, month 4, he twisted her wrist behind her back because she had smiled at a customer at the diner. A male customer. Wade had been sitting in his usual booth watching, and later that night in her apartment, he grabbed her wrist and twisted until she gasped and told her that smiling at men was disrespectful to him, that she was his, that she needed to understand what that meant. Grace tried to leave. Month 5. She packed a bag while Wade was at work, told Ethan they were going to stay with a friend. But Grace had no friends. Wade had made sure of that. He had isolated her methodically the way predators do, cutting connections one by one, until the only voice she heard was his. When Wade found out she had packed a bag, he didn't hit her. He did something worse. He sat at her kitchen table with his badge on the counter between them and explained calmly, precisely the way you explain a legal statute, that if she tried to leave, he would have Ethan taken by Child Protective Services. He would file a report saying Grace was an unfit mother. He would use his authority as police chief to ensure she never saw her son again. And who would they believe, a waitress with a GED she never finished, or the chief of police? Grace unpacked the bag. The hitting started in earnest after that. Month 6, a slap that left her ear ringing for a day. Month 7, a punch to the ribs that cracked 2 of them. Grace went to the emergency room at Riverside Hospital. A nurse named Karen Finley saw the bruises, the way Grace flinched when anyone came too close, the practiced lie in her eyes. Karen filed a mandatory domestic violence report and sent it to the police department. 3 days later, Wade Prescott appeared at the hospital during Karen's shift. He found her in the break room, closed the door, told her the woman who filed the complaint had mental health issues, was known for making false accusations, and that if Karen pursued it, he would file harassment charges and report her to the nursing board. Karen had $140,000 in student loans. She couldn't lose her license. She backed down. Ethan told his school counselor, a woman named Brenda Holloway. Brenda called Grace for a meeting, but Grace had to lie, had to say everything was fine because Wade had made clear what would happen if she didn't. Brenda documented family adjustment issues, no intervention needed, and closed the case. A neighbor called 911 after hearing screaming through the walls. Police arrived. Officers who worked for Wade, who answered to Wade, who owed their careers to Wade. They asked Grace if she was safe. Grace said yes. Wade was standing 3 feet behind the officers, making a cutting motion across his throat. The officers left. Grace applied for a restraining order. She sat in the county courthouse waiting room for 4 hours with a folder of photographs she had taken of her own bruises at 3 in the morning when Ethan was asleep. Purple and yellow galaxies mapped across her ribs and arms. She showed them to the clerk, filled out every form, answered every question, described in clinical detail what Wade Prescott had done to her body. Judge Harold Fleming reviewed the application in his chambers, denied it. Judge Fleming and Wade played golf together every other Saturday at the Ashford Springs Country Club. Their families had Thanksgiving dinner together. Their children had gone to the same summer camp. The judge cited insufficient evidence and pattern of voluntary contact and sent Grace home to the man who was systematically destroying her. Every door, every system, every institution designed to protect a woman and her child from the man destroying them. All of them closed, not because they didn't work, because the man doing the destroying controlled them all. But Grace Dawson was not the passive victim the world saw when it looked at her. She was not the woman who had simply accepted her fate. She was the woman who was preparing. It started with the phone. Grace had an old phone, a prepaid burner she had bought at a gas station with cash 2 months ago. She kept it inside the lining of her winter coat in a slit she had cut along the seam. 3 times she had managed to record Wade's voice. Not the beatings. Those were too chaotic, too violent, too full of her own screaming to capture anything useful. But the quiet moments afterward, when Wade would sit at her kitchen table and explain in his calm, authoritative voice exactly what he would do if she ever told anyone. 3 recordings. The first Wade describing how he would have Ethan removed, how he had done it before to another woman, how the system worked when you controlled it. The second Wade on his phone late at night thinking Grace was asleep, talking to someone about children, about placements, about money. The third Wade telling Grace about Diana Sutton. Diana Sutton, the name that Wade used like a weapon, his ex-girlfriend, 4 years ago. A woman who had been bright and curious and alive, who had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to know the same way Grace had, and who had died on a curve of Route 17 at 65 miles per hour when her brakes failed on a rainy October night. The investigation was conducted by Wade's own department, concluded within 72 hours. Accidental death, brake failure due to wear. Case closed, filed, and forgotten. A woman reduced to a statistic, a line item in the county coroner's annual report. But Wade had told Grace the truth one Sunday night after he had been drinking, after he had knocked out her gold tooth, and she lay on the floor trying not to move, trying not to breathe too loudly, trying to disappear into the carpet. He stood over her bourbon on his breath, and he spoke with the casual authority of a man describing department procedure. Diana found out something she shouldn't have. Same as you. And she had an accident. But it wasn't an accident. I took care of her. And if you tell anyone what you heard, if you have any evidence, if you even think about reporting me, you'll have an accident too. Grace had lain on the floor with blood filling her mouth and the gold tooth sitting on the linoleum beside her head, and she had made a decision, not to run, not to fight, to prepare. She told Ethan to pick up the tooth. She told him it was evidence. She told him that if something happened to her, if she disappeared, he was to take the tooth and the phone to the FBI field office in Richmond. She told him the address, made him memorize it. But Ethan was 10, and 10-year-olds don't go to Richmond. 10-year-olds go to the nearest place they can think of that might have a weapon that could stop a monster. Grace sat at the kitchen table and waited. She did not know where Ethan had gone exactly. She knew only that he had gone to do something brave and dangerous and wrong because every right option had been taken from them. Her phone rang at 4:07 in the afternoon. "Ms. Dawson, my name is Dean Hargrove. Your son, Ethan, is safe. He's with me at my pawn shop. He told me about Wade Prescott, about what happened Sunday, about Thursday." Grace's hand tightened on the phone. Her broken ribs screamed. "I need you to listen very carefully," the voice continued. "In the next 2 hours, members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club are going to arrive at your apartment building. We're setting up protection 24 hours a day until this is resolved. We're also contacting the FBI. You're not alone anymore. Do you understand?" Silence. Grace held the phone and tried to remember what it felt like to believe someone when they said things would be okay. She had forgotten. 8 months of Wade Prescott had taught her that promises were just the preamble to pain. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." "Because your son walked 3 miles in the freezing rain to ask for help. And when a 10-year-old is that desperate, it means every adult in his life already failed him. We're not going to fail you. Pack a bag if you need to, but you're not facing Thursday alone." Grace pressed the phone against her forehead, closed her eyes. The tears came not from sadness, but from something she had not felt in months. Relief, the dangerous, terrifying relief of someone who has been holding up a collapsing roof for so long that their arms have gone numb, and now someone says, "You can put it down." "There's something you should know," Grace said. Her voice was steadier now, steadier than it had been in months. "I have recordings, 3 of them. On a phone I hid in my coat. Wade talking about the children, about Diana, about what he planned to do to me. I've been collecting evidence." The line went silent for a moment. "You recorded him?" "Yes. I knew no one would believe me without proof. He controls everything. The police, the courts, the hospital. My word means nothing against his badge. So I recorded him. And I hid the phone in my son's shoe in the lining in case Wade searched the apartment. The evidence walks out the door with Ethan every morning." Another pause. Then the voice on the other end said something Grace would remember for the rest of her life. "Ma'am, you're not just a witness, you're the case." Back at the pawn shop, Rattler hung up the phone and looked at the boy sitting on the bench by the window, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like motor oil and old leather. Ethan Dawson, 10 years old. The bravest person Rattler had met in a life that included combat Marines. "She's got recordings," Rattler said. Frank Caldwell, the man the club knew as Bison, had arrived 12 minutes earlier. President of the Virginia chapter. 52 years old, built like something you'd find on a wildlife preserve, the kind of man who entered a room and the room rearranged itself around him. He'd taken one look at Ethan, at the patch on the boy's jacket, at Rattler's face, and his expression had shifted from curious to something harder and older. Now Bison leaned forward in the folding chair he'd pulled up next to the counter. "Recordings of what?" "Wade Prescott on the phone talking about children being moved, payments, and about his ex-girlfriend, Diana Sutton. How her death wasn't an accident. How he'll do the same to Ethan's mom." Bison's jaw tightened. He had 3 daughters. The youngest was 12, close enough to Ethan's age to make this personal. Everything was already personal, but that made it visceral. "Wade Prescott," Bison said. The name sat in his mouth like something foul. "Victor's brother," Rattler nodded. They both knew the name. They knew it because 3 months earlier, the club had helped break open a case involving Victor Prescott, a funeral director who had been faking children's deaths and selling them to international buyers through a network of corrupt foster care placements. Victor Prescott was now in federal prison awaiting trial. But the investigation had always felt incomplete. There had always been a shadow hanging over it, a question that gnawed at everyone involved. How had a funeral director in a small Virginia town operated a child trafficking ring for nearly 4 years without a single law enforcement inquiry? How had 6 children vanished from the foster care system, each one classified as a runaway, without anyone connecting the dots? The answer had been staring them in the face the entire time. The man responsible for connecting those dots, the man whose job it was to investigate missing children and suspicious deaths, was the same man profiting from them. His brother was the law enforcement. The realization hit Rattler like a round to the chest. This wasn't just a domestic violence case. This was the missing piece of a trafficking network that had stolen children. Wade Prescott hadn't just been beating Grace Dawson to keep her quiet about an affair or a drinking problem. He had been beating her to protect a criminal empire. And he had killed before to protect it. Bison stood, his chair scraped against the floor. "Listen up, Ethan." He knelt so he was at the boy's level. I need you to hear something. My name is Frank, but everyone calls me Bison. I'm the president of this club, and I'm about to make a phone call that's going to bring every brother we have to your apartment building. 6 men standing outside your door every 6 hours, 24 hours a day, with cameras running. Your mom is not going to be alone. Wade Prescott is not getting near her. Not Thursday, not ever. Understand? But what about the police, Ethan asked. If you're there, won't Wade's officers arrest you? Let them try. We're not breaking any laws. We're standing on public property. We're not threatening anyone. We're just present. And if Wade Prescott wants to try something with 200 witnesses and cameras recording, that's on him. 200. Rattler heard the number and felt something shift. Bison wasn't just mobilizing the Virginia chapter. He was calling in every favor from every neighboring state. This was going full scale. We're also calling the FBI, Bison continued. Real FBI. Federal jurisdiction. Prescott might control local police and county judges, but he doesn't control the federal government. I've got a contact, retired agent named Gerald Whitmore. We call him Prophet. He spent 30 years with the Bureau, still has connections. He'll know exactly who to call. Bison pulled out his phone, made the first call. Prophet, it's Bison. Remember the Prescott case, Victor Prescott? I need everything you still have on his brother. Wade, the police chief. We've got a situation. A boy just walked into Rattler's shop. His mom is Wade's girlfriend. She overheard trafficking conversations and recorded them. Wade's been assaulting her, planning to kill her Thursday. We've got 48 hours. The second call. Brothers, it's Bison. I need every member at 1547 Riverside Apartments in Ashford Springs. Now, bring your vests. Bring cameras. We're setting up protection detail. 48-hour countdown. Domestic violence victim. Abuser is Police Chief Wade Prescott. Victor Prescott's brother. The trafficking case. The victim's 10-year-old son just tried to buy a gun to protect his mother. We are not letting this happen. I want 6 brothers per shift, 4 shifts. We rotate every 6 hours. This is not a request. This is a call to protect family. He hung up, looked at Rattler. They're coming. Rattler knew they would. This was what the word brotherhood meant when you stripped away the leather and the chrome and the noise. Not the criminal stereotype that movies sold. Real brotherhood. The kind that said when a child is in danger, when a woman is being destroyed, when every system designed to protect them has been corrupted by the man destroying them, we step in, we fill the gap. We become the wall that should have existed all along. He looked at Ethan. The boy was watching Bison with wide eyes, the kind of expression a child wears when they realize that adults can be powerful and good at the same time. That authority doesn't have to mean cruelty. That size and strength can stand between you and danger instead of being the danger itself. You did good, Ethan. You were so brave, but you don't have to be brave anymore. We've got this now. Ethan touched the patch on his chest. Am I really part of your family now? Rattler thought of Jolene, of how she had always wanted someone to stand between her and the fists, of how she never got that chance. Yeah, son, you really are. By 6:47 in the evening, 3 hours and 24 minutes after Ethan had walked into the pawn shop, the rumble started. It began low and distant, like thunder rolling across the Virginia hills. Residents of Riverside Apartments looked up from dinner, from television, from the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday evening. The sound grew, not chaotic, not wild, organized, purposeful. The synchronized thunder of engines that had ridden together through years of open road and shared purpose. 50 Harley-Davidsons rolled into the parking lot in perfect formation. 2 columns of 25. They parked in sequence, each rider finding position like pieces sliding into a puzzle designed long before this night. Engines roared in unison for exactly 5 seconds. A statement, a declaration, then silence. 50 men dismounted. Black leather vests bearing the club insignia, Virginia chapter, some with gray beards and weathered faces, some younger, barely 30, but every one of them wearing the same pine, every one of them there for the same reason. Bison stood at the front, raised one hand. Listen up. We're not here to threaten. We're not here to intimidate. We're here to protect. Unit 3B, second floor. Grace Dawson and her son, Ethan. The threat is Police Chief Wade Prescott. He's scheduled for Thursday night, but he may come sooner once he hears we're here. 6 brothers per shift, 4 6-hour rotations. Cameras running 24/7. We document everything, we stay calm, we stay legal, and we do not let that woman face Thursday alone. Understood? 50 voices. Understood. And then something happened that defied every expectation the residents of Riverside Apartments might have had about what happens when 50 bikers descend on a low-income apartment complex. Quiet descended. 6 men in leather vests positioned themselves outside Unit 3B. 3 stood. 3 sat in folding chairs they had brought. No shouting, no engines revving, no aggression, just presence. Gerald Sullivan set up a camera on a tripod aimed at the apartment door. Documentation, evidence, protection. The remaining 44 brothers dispersed to strategic positions. Parking lot, building entrances, vehicles with clear sight lines. Every position calculated, every angle covered. Military precision from men who had learned discipline in places with names that still echoed in their sleep. Fallujah, Kandahar, Paris Island. Mrs. Dolores Reeves, 71 years old, had lived in Unit 2A of Riverside Apartments for 19 years. She had heard the screaming from 3B. She had heard it more times than she could all count over the past 8 months. Muffled thuds, a woman crying, a man's voice low and threatening, the kind of voice that doesn't need to shout because it carries the weight of absolute power. Mrs. Reeves had called 911 once. Officers came. Officers left. The screaming continued the next week. Now she stood at her window and watched 50 men in leather vests arrange themselves around her building with the quiet efficiency of soldiers. She didn't know what they were doing or why they were there, but she saw them look up at Unit 3B, and she saw the cameras, and she understood in the wordless way that neighbors understand things they have been trying not to know, that someone had finally come for the woman upstairs. Mrs. Reeves made coffee, carried a tray of mugs down to the parking lot, set it on the hood of a truck. For the boys, she said, it's cold tonight. One of the brothers, a man whose road name was Gage, took a mug, nodded. Thank you, ma'am. We'll be here a while. Good, Mrs. Reeves said. You should have been here months ago. We all should have been. She went back inside. Other residents began to notice. Curtains pulled back. Faces at windows, some afraid, some curious, some relieved. By 9 o'clock, 4 more residents had brought blankets, food, a thermos of hot chocolate. The community that had been too scared or too indifferent to help Grace Dawson was beginning to understand that help had arrived not from the places it was supposed to come from, but from the places no one expected. Inside Unit 3B, Grace Dawson stood at her window, curtain pulled back just enough to see. She stared at the men below. She had been a waitress for 8 years, invisible, the kind of person people ordered from but never truly saw. Waitress, single mom, background furniture in a world that noticed police chiefs and judges and men with authority. And now 50 men wearing serpent patches had surrounded her building to protect her from the most powerful person in town. Rattler stood behind her. He had driven Ethan home and come up to explain, to make sure she understood what was happening and why. She turned to him. Her face carried the map of 8 months of destruction. Bruises covered badly with drugstore foundation. The gap where her gold tooth had been. Strangulation marks barely hidden by the scarf she hadn't taken off in days. He saw Jolene Byron. He always would. Every woman who wore those marks would look like Jolene to him for the rest of his life. Why, Grace whispered. Why would you do this for us? Rattler looked at this woman who had endured 8 months of systematic violence, who had been isolated from every source of help, who had been told by the most powerful man in her town that she was nothing, that she belonged to him, that her life could be ended as easily as signing an insurance form. And yet she had recorded him. She had hidden evidence in her son's shoe. She had prepared for the moment when someone, anyone, might finally listen. Because you matter, Rattler said. You and Ethan matter. And mattering means being worth protecting. Grace turned back to the window. Watched the men below standing guard in the November cold breath, rising like smoke leather vests gleaming under the parking lot lights. For the first time in 8 months, Grace Dawson was not alone. She pressed her hand against the glass as if she could feel the warmth of their presence through the cold window. Behind her, Ethan was asleep on the couch, still wearing the patch pinned to his jacket. The boy who had walked 3 miles in the rain, carrying a bloody tooth, had finally stopped walking. Outside, the November wind picked up. The men below didn't move. They stood their ground the way men stand their ground when they have decided that nothing, not cold, not authority, not a corrupt police chief with a department at his disposal, will move them from the place where they are needed. And somewhere across town, Wade Prescott had no idea that his world was about to collapse. That the woman he had broken had been building a case against him stitch by hidden stitch. That the child he had terrorized had found the one door in the whole town that opened instead of closing. That 50 men in leather vests were standing between him and the Thursday he had planned. He would find out soon enough. And in the silence of that first peaceful night, she had known in 8 months Grace Dawson slept. Not the fractured, watchful sleep of a woman expecting violence. Real sleep. Deep sleep. The kind that comes when someone finally tells your body that the war might be ending. She dreamed of a kitchen, a clean kitchen with sunlight coming through the window, and Ethan sitting at the table doing homework, and a cup of coffee that she could drink slowly without watching the door, without counting the minutes until danger arrived. A simple dream, the kind of dream that anyone else would call Guam ordinary. But for a woman who had spent 8 months inside a war zone disguised as a relationship ordinary was the most extraordinary thing she could imagine. Downstairs, Rattler sat in his truck in the parking lot. He wasn't on shift. His rotation didn't start until midnight. But he couldn't leave, saying. He sat behind the wheel with the engine off and Jolene's photograph on the dashboard, the same photo he had carried in his wallet for 16 years. He looked at her face, young and smiling, and full of the future she would never have, and he spoke to her the way he always did when no one could hear. I found one Joe. I found someone I can save this time. I know it doesn't fix what happened to you. Nothing fixes that. But this woman and her boy, they're going to make it. I'm going to make sure of it. I promise you that. The photograph didn't answer. It never did. But the guilt in Rattler's chest, the weight he had been carrying since that thin envelope in Ramadi shifted. Not gone, never gone, but lighter, like someone had taken one stone from the pile. Outside, the brothers kept watch. The night grew cold. November wind howled through the parking lot, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees that lined Riverside Road. The men stood their ground. They didn't complain. They didn't waver. They had made a promise to a 10-year-old boy, and promises to these men were not words. They were architecture. They were the beams that held up the house. And somewhere across town, in a house paid for with money from stolen children, Wade Prescott poured himself a glass of bourbon and watched the 11 o'clock news without knowing that the 11 o'clock news by this time next week would be about him. He had no idea that the woman he had broken had been building something from the broken pieces. That the boy he had terrorized had found the one door in the whole town that opened instead of closing. That 50 men in leather vests were standing between him and the Thursday he had planned. That a retired FBI agent was already on the phone with an active agent who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of break. He finished his bourbon, went to bed, slept soundly. He would not sleep soundly again for the rest of his life. Wednesday, 9:23 a.m., 16 hours since Ethan Dawson had walked into Rattler's pawn shop carrying a bloody tooth. The unmarked sedan that pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Apartments looked like every other government vehicle in Virginia. Dark blue, clean, anonymous. The kind of car that could pass through any neighborhood without drawing attention. But the woman who stepped out of it carried the kind of authority that didn't need a siren to announce itself. Special Agent Pamela Rhodes, FBI. 41 years old, 15 years with the Bureau's Public Corruption Unit. She had spent the last 3 years investigating dirty cops in Virginia, the kind of systematic rot that doesn't show on the surface, but eats through the foundation until the whole structure is ready to collapse. Wade Prescott's name had appeared in 14 separate complaints filed over the past 4 years. 14 complaints that had vanished from her desk before she could act on them. Rerouted, misfiled, lost in the labyrinth of bureaucratic interference that a police chief with connections could orchestrate from the comfort of his office. Until yesterday, when Gerald Whitmore, the man the club called Prophet, a former colleague who had retired after 30 years with the Bureau but still kept his contacts sharp, called her with 6 words that changed everything. We've got a witness willing to testify. Not just willing, prepared. A witness with recordings. Agent Rhodes walked past 6 Hells Angels standing outside the door to Unit 3B. They nodded, stepped aside. One held the door open for her. She noticed the cameras, the documentation, the discipline. These were not the chaos merchants that television had taught America to expect. These were men standing watch. Ma'am Bison said, "Miss Dawson is inside. She's ready to talk." Rhodes entered the apartment and found Grace Dawson sitting at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Ethan beside her. Rattler standing in the corner with his arms crossed, a sentinel in leather. Ms. Dawson, I'm Special Agent Pamela Rhodes. I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Grace's hands shook, but she talked. She talked for 47 minutes without stopping, and what came out of her was not the scattered, fragmentary account of a traumatized woman struggling to remember. It was organized, chronological, precise, because Grace Dawson had been preparing for this conversation for 2 months, ever since she started hiding a phone in the lining of her coat, ever since she realized that no one in Ashford Springs would help her, and that the only chance she had was to build a case so airtight that someone outside this town's sphere of corruption would have to act on it. She described meeting Wade, the honeymoon phase, the way he had studied her, the way a predator studies the landscape before it moves in, learning the terrain, identifying the vulnerabilities, mapping the isolation. The first grab which she had forgiven, because forgiveness was cheaper than facing the truth. The escalation, the broken ribs that she couldn't get treated because the hospital would file a report, and the report would go to Wade, and the cycle would close around her tighter. The strangulation, Wade's hands around her throat for what felt like minutes, but was probably 30 seconds long enough for her vision to narrow to a pinpoint, and for her to understand with the clarity that comes only at the edge of death that this man was going to kill her. Not might, was going to. It was not a question of if, but when. The tooth knocked from her jaw on a Sunday night while her son hid in a closet and listened to the sounds of his mother being destroyed. Then she described the phone call. November 5th, Wade sitting in the back booth of Riverside Diner at 10:47 at night. The diner was closing. Grace was wiping down tables. Wade thought he was alone. He wasn't. Grace was in the kitchen, separated from him by a service window, close enough to hear every word through the gap where the orders came through. He was on his cell phone, talking to someone named Victor. Everything set for the next shipment. Judge Fleming approved 3 placements today. Foster care to your facility. The families have no idea their kids are being sold. $200,000 each. 3 kids, $600,000 total. I'll make sure there's no investigation. Any missing persons reports, I close them immediately. Runaways, that's what I call them. Runaways. Grace recited it from memory, word for word. She had replayed that conversation in her head every night for a week, burning it into her brain, knowing that if something happened to her phone, if the recordings were found and destroyed, her memory would be the last line of evidence. Then she pulled the phone from a plastic bag she'd retrieved from the bottom of a box of cereal in her pantry. She'd moved it from Ethan's shoe that morning once she knew help had arrived. She set it on the table in front of Agent Rhodes. 3 recordings. This one has Wade on the phone talking about the children. This one has him telling me what he'll do if I report him. And this one has him talking about Diana Sutton, about how he killed her and made it look like an accident. Agent Rhodes stared at the phone. In 15 years with the Bureau, she had seen evidence appear in many forms. Documents pulled from shredders, financial records hidden in storage units, confessions extracted in interrogation rooms. But she had never seen evidence like this. A woman isolated, broken, terrorized by the most powerful man in her county, who had nonetheless found the discipline and the courage to secretly record her abuser and hide the recordings in the places he would never think to look. You did this yourself, Rhodes asked. Grace nodded. Nobody was coming. I knew nobody was coming. The nurse tried and got threatened. The counselor tried and got lied to. The police work for him. The judge is his friend. If I was going to survive, I had to build the case myself. I just didn't know who to give it to. Rhodes picked up the phone, played the first recording. Wade Prescott's voice filled the kitchen of Unit 3B, calm and authoritative, the voice of a man who was so confident in his power that he didn't bother to whisper. The FBI agent's expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster. When the recordings were finished, Rhodes looked at Grace with an expression that Grace would later describe as the first time an authority figure looked at her and saw the truth. Ms. Dawson, these recordings are admissible under Virginia's one-party consent law. You were present during each conversation. You had every right to record, combined with physical evidence and witness testimony. This is enough to build a federal case. But I need more. I need medical documentation. I need the tooth. I need anyone else who saw what was happening and can testify to the system's failure. We have all of that, Bison said from the doorway. We've got a brother who's a retired paramedic, Vincent Kowalski. We call him Stitch. He can examine Ms. Dawson document everything photograph injuries. He's testified as an expert witness before. Get him here, Rhodes said. Now. Wednesday, 2:14 p.m. Vincent Kowalski arrived. Road named Stitch, 58 years old, 26 years as a paramedic before his knees gave out and the nightmares got worse than the calls. He examined Grace in her bedroom while Agent Rhodes and a female victim advocate waited outside the door. 23 minutes. That's how long it took to document 8 months of violence written across a woman's body. Stitch emerged with a file folder. His face was the color of ash. His hands that had stabilized car accident victims and delivered babies on roadsides and held the wounded in places where no ambulance could reach, were shaking. 2 broken ribs, left side healing but improperly set. She never got treatment. Bruising consistent with being kicked while on the ground. Strangulation marks on the neck. Handprint shaped. Less than a week old. These marks indicate sustained pressure for at least 30 seconds. That's not assault. That's attempted homicide. Any longer and she'd be dead. Black eyes both sides, different stages of healing. One from 5 days ago, one from approximately 2 weeks ago. Repeated facial strikes, missing tooth, upper left molar. Extraction site shows forceful trauma, not dental procedure. Bruising on both arms consistent with being grabbed and restrained, and defensive wounds on her forearms. She tried to protect herself. Stitch paused. His voice was clinical, the professional tone he had used 10,000 times. But underneath it, barely controlled, was the kind of rage that men like Stitch had learned to channel rather than release. In my professional opinion, these injuries are 100% consistent with severe escalating domestic violence over an extended period. The strangulation is the most concerning indicator. Research consistently shows that strangulation is the strongest predictor of future lethality in domestic violence cases. If this woman remains accessible to her abuser, I would estimate a 70% probability that the next assault will be fatal. Agent Rhodes added the medical report to her growing file. She's not going back to him. Federal protective custody, both her and Ethan, starting now. But first, Rhodes needed witnesses. Not just Grace, not just recordings and bank records. She needed the people who had seen the system fail. The people who had tried to help and been silenced. The people whose testimony would prove that Wade Prescott hadn't just abused one woman. He had weaponized every institution in Ashford Springs to ensure that no victim could ever escape. The first witness arrived at 10:23 p.m. Karen Findley, 29 years old, ER nurse at Riverside Hospital. She walked into Unit 3B with her head down and her shoulders drawn in like a person bracing for a blow that had already landed. Ms. Findley, Agent Rhodes said, "You filed a domestic violence report on Grace Dawson 2 months ago. Is that correct?" Karen nodded. Her voice was barely audible. September 18th, she came in with broken ribs, visible bruising. I asked her privately if she was safe at home. She said she fell, but I've been a nurse long enough to know what a fall looks like and what a fist looks like. I filed a mandatory report, sent it to the police department. That's standard protocol. What happened to that report? Karen's hands twisted together in her lap. 3 days later, Police Chief Prescott came to the hospital, found me during my shift. He told me the woman who filed the complaint had mental health issues, said she was known for making false accusations, said if I pursued it, he'd file harassment charges against me and report me to the nursing board for privacy violations. She paused. I have $140,000 in student loans. I can't lose my license. I can't lose my ability to work. So I backed down. I said nothing. I let the report die. She looked at Grace. The two women held each other's gaze across the small kitchen table, and in that gaze was everything that needed to be said about how systems designed to protect women are dismantled by men with enough power to threaten the protectors. "I'm the reason you went home to more violence," Karen whispered. "I filed the report, and then I let a man in a uniform scare me into silence. I failed you, and I'm so sorry." Grace stood, walked to Karen, put a hand on her shoulder, the same gesture that Rattler had used with her. Kindness passed forward. "You tried," Grace said. "You tried more than most people did. Thank you for filing that report, even though it got destroyed. Thank you for trying." The second witness arrived at 11:04 p.m. Brenda Holloway, 42 years old, school counselor at Ashford Springs Elementary. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Mrs. Holloway Rhodes said, "Ethan Dawson disclosed abuse to you. Tell me what happened." Brenda's voice shook. October 15th. Ethan was struggling in class, withdrawn, falling asleep at his desk. I called him to my office, asked if everything was okay at home. He said his mom had a boyfriend who was a police officer, said sometimes the boyfriend made his mom cry. I asked if the boyfriend hurt his mom. Ethan got very quiet, wouldn't answer, but I could see it in his eyes. He wanted to tell me something and he was too scared to say the words. She took a shaky breath. I called his mother for a meeting. Standard procedure. But when I called Grace, she denied everything, said Ethan was just adjusting to a new father figure, said everything was fine, and I accepted it. I documented family adjustment issues, no intervention needed, and closed the case. Brenda looked at Ethan, who was sitting on the couch watching. Ethan tried to tell me his mom's boyfriend was hurting her, and I called the mom instead of calling Child Protective Services directly. I gave the abuser a warning. I put that child in more danger because I followed a procedure instead of following my instincts. I am a mandated reporter. My job is to protect children, and I protected the wrong person. Ethan stood up, walked to Mrs. Holloway. He was still wearing Rattler's patch on his jacket. He looked older than 10. He looked like a child who had been given permission to be a child again, but hadn't quite remembered how. "It's okay," Ethan said. "You were trying to follow the rules. The rules are just broken." The third witness arrived at 11:52 p.m., Officer Dale Murdoch, 41 years old, Ashford Springs Police Department, 15 years on the force. He stood in the doorway of Unit 3B like a man reporting for a duty he wished he didn't know. Officer Murdoch Rhodes said, "You responded to a 911 call at Riverside Apartments on October 28th. What did you observe?" Murdoch stood at attention. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man giving testimony he had rehearsed in his mind 100 times. "Dispatch received a call from a neighbor reporting screaming from Unit 3B. I responded with my partner. We knocked. Chief Prescott answered the door. He was calm, professional, told us it was a disagreement and everything was fine. We asked to speak to Ms. Dawson. She appeared behind him with a visible black eye. Split lip. We asked if she needed help. He paused. She said she was fine. Said she fell. Chief Prescott was standing directly behind us. I saw him make a gesture, a throat-cutting motion. Miss Dawson saw it too. I could see the terror in her eyes, but she kept saying she was fine. "What did you do?" "I filed a report. Domestic dispute. Victim declined assistance. Situation resolved. And I submitted it to Chief Prescott. Because he's my commanding officer, that's chain of command. The report goes to the chief." Murdoch looked at Grace. The weight of what he was about to say was visible in the way his shoulders dropped. "I saw your black eye. I saw your split lip. I saw the chief make a threatening gesture to you while you were trying to answer my questions. And I reported it to your abuser because he's my boss. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. But I followed procedure instead of doing what was right. I could have called state police. I could have contacted the FBI. Instead, I filed a report and walked away. And you kept getting hurt because of it." He removed his badge, set it on the table. "I'm resigning. Effective immediately. I can't wear this anymore." Rhodes picked up the badge, held it for a moment, then handed it back to him. "You're not resigning. You're testifying. You're going to help me prove that Wade Prescott weaponized the chain of command to bury evidence and silence victims. Your testimony shows how he used institutional authority to obstruct justice. That's a federal crime, and it's going to help put him away for the rest of his life." Murdoch took the badge back, held it in his palm, looked at it like he was seeing it for the first time. "Then I'll testify, and after that I'll decide whether I deserve to wear it." Wednesday, 4:52 p.m., 31 hours since Ethan had walked into the pawn shop. Rhodes's phone rang. She answered, listened. Her expression shifted from professional calm to something harder. "Understood, I'm handling it." She hung up, looked at Bison and Rattler. "We have a problem. Wade Prescott just filed a formal harassment complaint against the Hells Angels with the Virginia State Police. He's claiming you're illegally intimidating a law enforcement officer. He's demanding you disperse immediately, or he'll have state troopers remove you for unlawful assembly." Bison didn't flinch. "We're on public property. We're not blocking access to the building. We're not threatening anyone. We're exercising our constitutional right to peaceful assembly." "I know that. You know that. But he's the police chief. He has connections at the state level. And he's not stopping there. He's also called the county prosecutor. He wants a temporary restraining order against the club. If he gets it, you'll be forced to leave. The room went quiet. Everyone understood what that meant. If the bikers were removed, Grace and Ethan would be unprotected, and Wade Prescott had already announced what Thursday would bring. How long before a TRO hearing, Rattler asked. 24 hours if he pushes it, Rhodes said. But here's the thing, I can block it with federal authority if I have active warrants. Once this becomes a federal investigation, a county judge can't issue orders that interfere with federal protective operations. Then we need those warrants, Bison said. Rhodes was already dialing. She had been building cases against corrupt officials for 15 years. She knew the rhythm. You start with the evidence, you build the narrative, you identify the charges, and then you move with overwhelming force before the target has time to shred, burn, flee, or kill. In Wade Prescott's case, all four of those options were on the table. This is Agent Rhodes. I need arrest warrants for Wade James Prescott, police chief of Ashford Springs. Charges: felony assault, attempted homicide via strangulation, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and financial fraud, including undisclosed offshore accounts. Get Judge Morrison. Federal judge, not county. I need these warrants signed within 2 hours. And I need a search warrant for his residence, his office at the police department, and his personal vehicle. Seizure warrant for all electronic devices and financial records. She made a second call. Prophet, it's Pamela. I need every piece of evidence you have on the Victor Prescott case that connects to Wade. Phone records, bank statements, case files where investigations were closed prematurely, every missing child report that crossed Wade's desk. I need it in 1 hour. Then she turned to a young man sitting in the corner who had been quiet until now. Tommy Bridges, road name Bite, 34 years old, lean, wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of face you'd expect to find behind a desk at a tech company not wearing a Hell's Angels vest. But Bite was the club's digital specialist, a man who had spent 15 years in cyber forensics before deciding that corporate security paid well but meant nothing. You told me you're good with computers, Rhodes said. Bite was already opening his laptop. I'm very good with computers. I need you to pull everything you can on Wade Prescott. Legal searches only, public records, property records, financial disclosures required of all county officials, court filings, anything that shows unexplained wealth or connections to his brother Victor's operations. On it. Wednesday, 7:33 p.m. The laptop screen glowed in the dim light of Grace's kitchen. Bite had been working for 3 hours, cross-referencing databases, pulling financial disclosures, mapping patterns with the focused intensity of a man who understood that data was a language, and criminals always left sentences unfinished. The others had been rotating between shifts outside and checking on progress inside. The apartment had become a command center. Maps on the wall, timeline written on the back of a cereal box, phone numbers and names connected by lines drawn in marker. Agent Rhodes sat at the table reviewing the witness statements, building the narrative that would become the federal complaint. Each testimony was a thread. Woven together, they formed a picture of systematic corruption so complete that no jury would be able to look away. Then Bite called from the corner. Agent Rhodes, you need to see this. He turned the screen. Bank records. An account in the Cayman Islands registered under a shell company called Ridgeline Holdings LLC, which was registered to a post office box in Delaware, which was owned by another shell company called Tidewater Consulting, which traced back through 3 layers of corporate filings and 6 months of financial records to Wade James Prescott. The money trail was designed to be invisible. It would have been invisible to anyone without Bite's particular combination of obsessiveness and skill. But shell companies leave fingerprints just like people do. They share registered agents. They reuse bank routing numbers. They file quarterly reports that, when placed side by side and read by someone who knows what to look for, spell out the word guilty in numbers and dates and dollar amounts. Deposits of $12,500 every 3 months for the past 4 years. 16 deposits total, $200,000. Cross-reference the deposit dates with the trafficking timeline from Victor's case, Rhodes said. Bite typed, pulled up another document. His face went still. They match. Every single deposit occurred exactly 1 week after a child was reported missing in cases that Wade Prescott personally closed and classified as runaways. 4 years, 6 children, $200,000 in protection payments from his brother's trafficking operation. Agent Rhodes felt her pulse quicken. This was the connection that every investigator who had ever looked at the Victor Prescott case had been missing. Not just that Wade knew about the trafficking, that he profited from it, that he was paid systematically and repeatedly to ensure that 6 children who were kidnapped and sold would never be searched for, that he had used his authority as police chief to classify their disappearances as voluntary runaways, closing cases that should have triggered multi-agency investigations. That's conspiracy to commit human trafficking, Rhodes said. Federal offense. Mandatory minimum 25 years. But Bite wasn't finished. There's more. His voice was careful now, the way people speak when they've found something that changes the size of what they're looking at. There's another account, older, same pattern. But this one ran from 2016 to 2020. The deposits stopped in March 2020. March 2020, the month Diana Sutton died. Bite pulled up more records. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the focused precision of a man who understood that every keystroke was building a cage around a killer. Life insurance policy, taken out on Diana Sutton, 2 months before her death. Beneficiary Wade Prescott, payout $180,000. The room went cold, not figuratively. The temperature seemed to drop. Rhodes stood up, paced the length of the small kitchen, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. He did it before she said. Diana found out about the trafficking network. The same way Grace did. Wade killed her, staged the car accident, collected the insurance money, and when Grace started asking questions about what she overheard, he followed the exact same playbook. Control her, isolate her. If she won't stay quiet, eliminate her and profit from it. Is there a policy on Grace? Rattler asked from the corner. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before storms. Bite searched. His screen refreshed. He stared at the document for a long moment before turning the laptop so everyone could see. Filed November 7th, 5 days ago. $250,000 life insurance policy on Grace Marie Dawson. Beneficiary Wade James Prescott. Effective immediately. No medical exam required. Premium paid in full. Grace was sitting at the table. She had been listening to everything. She had watched these strangers systematically dismantle the invisible cage that Wade had built around her, pulling it apart wire by wire, exposing the architecture of his cruelty for what it was. But this, the insurance policy, the knowledge that the man who shared her bed had taken out a $250,000 bet on her death 5 days ago, the same week he knocked out her tooth and told her Thursday was coming. He was planning it, Grace said. Her voice was flat, not shocked, past shock. He was planning it all along. From the moment I heard that phone call, he was going to kill me. Thursday wasn't a threat. It was a deadline, a business deadline. Not anymore, Rhodes said, because we're arresting him tonight, before Thursday ever comes. Wednesday, 11:47 p.m. The night was cold. Virginia November wild, the kind that gets into your bones and stays. 6 brothers stood watch outside Unit 3B. Cameras running. Bison had rotated the shifts twice already. Inside the apartment, Grace had finally agreed to rest. Ethan was asleep in his bed, the patch still pinned to his jacket hanging on the chair beside him. Rattler was in the parking lot sitting in his truck when he saw the headlights. A dark SUV, no plate, is rolling slow through the apartment complex parking lot with its headlights dimmed. Not off, dimmed, the kind of careful approach that a man makes when he wants to see without being seen. Rattler reached for his phone, texted Bison. Vehicle approaching. Dark SUV, no plates, moving slow. Bison texted back, copy, all positions alert. The SUV circled the lot once, passed the row of parked Harleys, slowed near the building entrance. Then it stopped. Engine running, lights off now. Sitting in the darkness about 40 yards from the building's rear entrance. A door that led to a stairwell that went directly to the second floor, directly to Unit 3B. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, large, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate confidence of someone who knew the layout of this building, who had walked these hallways many times, who had a key to apartment 3. Wade Prescott had decided not to wait for Thursday. Maybe he'd heard about the bikers. Word travels in small towns. A neighbor might have mentioned it. One of his officers might have driven past and reported the row of Harleys in the parking lot. Maybe the harassment complaint he'd filed that afternoon had been his way of testing the waters, and when the waters didn't part for him, the way they always had when the FBI shield went up and his TRO request was going to be blocked by federal authority, he realized that his window was closing. The careful timeline he had constructed, the insurance policy, the Thursday deadline, the clean disposal of another inconvenient woman, was falling apart. Desperate men make early moves. Desperate men with badges make the earliest moves of all because they have spent their careers operating in the space between law and violence. And when the law stops serving them, violence is the only tool they have left. He walked toward the rear entrance. He was wearing dark clothes. No uniform, no badge visible. In his right hand, he carried something that reflected the parking lot light for just a moment. Metal. Small. Gage saw him first. Gage, positioned at the northeast corner of the building, with a clear view of the rear entrance, radioed to the brothers at the front. Movement at the back. One male, armed, moving toward the rear stairwell door. 4 brothers converged on the rear entrance. They didn't run. They walked. The measured, unhurried approach of men who understood that speed creates chaos and chaos creates accidents. They positioned themselves between Wade Prescott and the door. 4 men in leather vests, cameras on their chests, recording everything. Wade stopped. 20 feet from the door, he saw them. His jaw tightened. "Evening," Bison said. He had appeared from the side of the building, stepping into the space between Wade and the stairwell door as if he had simply materialized from the November darkness. "You're a long way from home, Chief. Get out of my way." Wade's voice was flat, the voice of authority, the voice that had commanded officers and silenced witnesses and bent judges to his will. "This is none of your business. I'm visiting someone who lives here." At midnight, with no plates on your vehicle and whatever that is in your hand, Wade looked down at his hand, then back at Bison. His expression shifted. The mask of authority flickered. Beneath it, something feral, something that understood it was being cornered. "You don't know what you're involved in. You think you're protecting her. You're making this worse. For her and for that boy." The camera on Gage's vest captured every word. The camera on the tripod by the front entrance captured the SUV with no plates. The camera on Bison's chest captured Wade Prescott's face, illuminated by the parking lot light, as he threatened a woman and child while surrounded by witnesses. That's when the door to the building opened. Grace Dawson stepped out. She was wearing a coat over her pajamas. Her feet were in slippers. Her hair was uncombed, and her face still carried the yellow remains of bruises. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been woken by voices in the parking lot and who had come downstairs not because she was brave, but because she was finished. Finished hiding. Finished being afraid. Finished letting this man decide when she lived and when she died. She had heard the voices from her kitchen table where she sat unable to sleep. She had recognized Wade's voice through the window, the way a soldier recognizes the sound of an incoming round before it lands. That voice had been the soundtrack to 8 months of destruction. She knew every register of it. The calm authority he used in public. The cold precision he used when making threats. The hot, breathless fury he used when his fists were flying. She had heard them all, and she had recorded them all, and now she was done listening from the other side of walls and doors in the distance of fear. The brothers parted to let her through, not because she asked, because the look on her face made it clear that this moment belonged to her. She walked until she was 10 feet from Wade Prescott, close enough to see his eyes, close enough for the cameras to capture both of their faces in the same frame. "I recorded everything," Grace said. Her voice didn't shake. For the first time in 8 months, her voice didn't shake. "Every conversation, every threat, every time you told me about Diana, every time you talked about the children, I recorded it all and I gave it to the FBI." Wade's face changed. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. What replaced it was the face beneath the face, the one that Grace had seen on Sunday nights when the bourbon was gone and the violence was fresh. The face of a man who had believed with absolute certainty that he was untouchable, discovering in a parking lot at midnight that he was not. "You're lying," he said, but his voice cracked on the second word. "I'm not lying, and I'm not Diana. Diana's dead because of you, but I'm standing here. I'm alive, and I'm going to testify. You don't control me anymore. You don't control any of this anymore. It's over." Wade took a step forward. One step. The brothers didn't move, but the air between them compressed, charged with the collective readiness of men who had been waiting all night for exactly this moment. Then Wade raised the object in his hand, not toward Grace, toward the sky. He fired once, a gunshot that cracked across the parking lot like a whip echoing off the apartment buildings, shattering the midnight silence. Lights came on in windows. Voices called out. Somewhere a child cried. "You think you've won," Wade said. His voice was shaking now. "You think these bikers and the FBI and your little recordings are going to stop what's coming. You have no idea what I'm connected to. No idea who protects me." He was bluffing. Grace could hear it. 8 months of living with this man had taught her to read the frequencies beneath his words. The bass note of confidence that had once made her believe he was untouchable was gone, replaced by something thinner, higher. The sound of a man who has built his entire identity on control and is watching that control dissolve in real time in a parking lot in front of cameras at midnight. Bison stepped forward. One step. That's enough. You just discharged a firearm in a residential area in front of 16 witnesses and 7 cameras. That's reckless endangerment, brandishing intimidation of a witness in violation of at least 4 federal statutes that Agent Rhodes is going to add to the list she's already building. I suggest you get back in your vehicle and drive home, because the next time you see these apartments, you'll be in handcuffs. Wade stood there for a long moment, the gun at his side, his breathing ragged, the feral thing behind his eyes calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find the angle that would let him maintain control. But there was no angle. There was no leverage. There was nothing left to manipulate. He turned, walked back to his SUV, got in. The engine started. The headlights came on. He pulled out of the parking lot slowly, deliberately, like a man who wanted to remember the faces of everyone who had stood against him. But the cameras had already remembered for him. Grace stood in the parking lot watching the taillights disappear around the corner of Riverside Road. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline that had carried her down the stairs and through the door and into the face of the man who had nearly killed her was draining away, and in its place was the trembling aftermath that comes when you realize what you just did. Rattler appeared beside her, put a hand on her shoulder. Careful, gentle. The touch of someone who understood that after 8 months of violence, even kindness could startle. "You okay?" Grace watched the road where the taillights had been. "I've never said those words to him before," she said. "I've never told him it's over. I've never stood in front of him and not been afraid." She paused. "I was afraid, but I did it anyway. Is that what brave feels like?" "Yeah," Rattler said. "That's exactly what it feels like." Bison was already on the phone. "Agent Rhodes, it's Bison. Prescott just showed up at Riverside Apartments. Midnight, no plates on his vehicle. Discharged a firearm in the parking lot. Threatened the witness. We've got it all on camera. 7 angles, audio. He's heading home now." Rhodes's response was immediate. "That accelerates everything. I'm calling the warrant team. We move at 6 a.m. I want the tactical team from Richmond on standby. If he's willing to show up armed at midnight, he's willing to run at dawn. We're not giving him the chance." She paused. "Then how's Grace?" "She's the bravest person I've met in a very long time," Bison said. There was a sound on the other end that might have been a small, grim laugh. "I believe that. Keep her safe for 6 more hours. Then it's our turn." Bison hung up, looked at his brothers, looked at Grace standing in the cold parking lot in her slippers with the resolve of a woman who had just reclaimed her own story from the man who had been writing it for her. 6 more hours, he said. "Then we end this. Let's get inside." Grace walked back into the building, past the brothers who stood aside for her with a respect that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. Past the cameras that had captured the moment she stopped being a victim and became a witness. Past the stairwell door that Wade Prescott had been heading toward with a weapon and a plan that would never be completed. She climbed the stairs to 3B, checked on Ethan, still sleeping, still wearing the patch on his jacket. The boy who had started all of this by walking 3 miles in the rain. Grace sat at the kitchen table. She did not sleep. She waited. 6 hours. She could wait 6 more hours. She had waited 80 months. She had waited her entire life for someone to show up, and they had, and now all she had to do was hold on until morning. She looked at the gold tooth in its tissue paper on the table. The tooth that Ethan had carried 3 miles in the rain. Such a small thing. A piece of metal and bone. A piece of her body that had been taken by force. And yet it had done what the police couldn't do, what the hospital couldn't do, what the courts and the school and every institution in Ashford Springs had failed to do. It had opened a door. Not the door to a pawn shop, though that was where Ethan had carried it. It had opened the door between desperation and hope, between silence and testimony, between a woman who was going to die on Thursday and a woman who was going to testify on. Grace set the tooth back on the table, poured herself a cup of coffee, drank it slowly, watching the clock on the microwave count down the minutes. At 4 in the morning, she heard the shift change outside, fresh brothers taking positions, quiet voices, the click of a thermos being opened. Mrs. Reeves from 2A had left another tray of coffee mugs in the hallway, the small kindnesses of neighbors who had finally decided to stop pretending they didn't hear the screaming. At 5, Grace showered, got dressed, clean jeans, a blue sweater, not the careful covering layers she wore when bruises needed hiding. Simple clothes, ordinary clothes. The clothes of a woman who didn't need to hide anymore. At 5:30, she woke Ethan, made him breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast. He sat at the table, still half asleep, eating quietly. He looked at her across the table. "Is it over, Mom?" "Almost," Grace said. "Almost." Thursday, 6:08 a.m. The sun was not yet above the tree line when the FBI's tactical team rolled into the quiet residential street where Wade Prescott lived. 3 black SUVs, no sirens, no lights. The kind of approach that looks like nothing from a distance and feels like everything when it arrives at your door. Wade Prescott was in his kitchen, making coffee, not counting money, not on the phone with criminals, not doing anything that looked like evil. He was wearing pajama pants and a gray t-shirt, pouring half and half into his coffee mug, listening to the morning weather report on the radio. A man who had strangled a woman unconscious 4 days ago. A man who had cut brake lines and staged a murder as an accident 4 years ago. A man who had accepted $200,000 to ensure that stolen children would never be searched for. Standing in his kitchen, pouring cream into coffee like any other Thursday morning. The front door came off its hinges at 6:08 on the dot. 6 federal agents in tactical gear flooded the kitchen. Wade dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the tile. Cream and coffee spreading across the floor like a small, meaningless flood. "Wade James Prescott, FBI, you're under arrest." They put him on the floor. Face against the tile he had chosen himself at the home improvement store 3 years ago. Arms wrenched behind his back. Hands that had knocked out a gold tooth. Hands that had wrapped around Grace Dawson's throat. Hands that had held a pipe cutter to a brake line, now pressed together by cold steel. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Wade tried to speak, tried to summon the voice of authority that had commanded a police department and silenced witnesses and bent an entire town to his will. "I'm the police chief. You can't do this. I know people. I have connections." Agent Pamela Rhodes knelt beside him on the tile. Her face was level with his. She spoke with the measured calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind for 3 years, waiting for the evidence, the witnesses, the recordings that would finally make it real. "You were the police chief. Past tense. You're a federal prisoner now. And the people you knew, the judge who owed you favors, the officers who followed your orders instead of the law, the hospital administrator you threatened, they're cooperating witnesses now. Every single one of them. You're done." They hauled him to his feet, walked him through his own house, past crime scene investigators already photographing evidence, past agents downloading his computer, past forensic accountants boxing up financial records that would trace dollar by dollar the price of 6 children's freedom, past the garage where a pipe cutter sat on a workbench, the same tool that had cut Diana Sutton's brake line 4 years ago, now tagged and bagged as Exhibit 47 in a federal case file. Outside, neighbors watched from their windows. Wade Prescott had lived on this street for 12 years. He had waved to these people, attended their block parties, helped their kids with bike safety presentations at the elementary school. He was the police chief. He was supposed to be the safest person on the street. Now he was being walked to a federal vehicle in handcuffs, his pajama pants flapping in the November wind, his bare feet on the cold driveway, because the agents hadn't given him time to find shoes. One neighbor, an elderly man named Harold, who had lived next door for a decade, stood at his mailbox and watched the procession. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He just watched, and in his watching was the slow, painful recognition that the man he had trusted to protect his neighborhood had been a predator hiding behind a badge. Wade Prescott had controlled everything for years. The investigations, the reports, the witnesses, the courts, the narrative of his own life. He had written himself as the hero, the dedicated public servant, The police chief who coached Little League and attended community barbecues and smiled for cameras with the practiced ease of a man who understood that appearance was the most valuable currency in a small town. He didn't control this. At 7:15 a.m., Judge Harold Fleming was arrested at his home by two FBI agents who had driven separately from the team that took Wade. The judge answered the door in his bathrobe. He looked at the badges, at the warrant, at the charges printed in block letters on federal paper. Obstruction of justice, conspiracy, abuse of judicial authority. The same hands that had signed the denial of Grace Dawson's restraining order were now placed behind his back. By 9:23 a.m., the Ashford Springs Police Department held a press conference. Lieutenant Brian Walsh Wade's second-in-command stood at the podium, looking like a man who had been asked to explain a fire that had been burning under his feet for years without his knowledge. Or perhaps with his knowledge. That question would be answered in the coming months. He described the arrest, the charges, the cooperation with federal authorities, and then he said something that the reporters would replay for weeks. I also want to address the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, who established a protection detail at Riverside Apartments this week. While unconventional, their actions were legal and necessary. They protected a witness when our own department failed to do so. I'm ashamed that it took outsiders to do the job we should have done. We failed Ms. Dawson and her son. We failed this community. That ends today. A reporter asked the question that cut through the noise. What would have happened if the bikers hadn't shown up? Walsh paused. The cameras caught the exact moment the answer moved across his face before he said it out loud. Wade Prescott would have returned Thursday night, and Grace Dawson would be dead. The silence in the press room lasted 4 full seconds, an eternity in broadcast news. Then the questions erupted, but the answer was already out there, traveling through wires and airwaves, reaching living rooms and phone screens, telling a story that the world needed to hear about what happens when systems fail and strangers step in. Thursday, 11:47 a.m. Wade Prescott sat in a federal holding cell. Bail denied. Judge Morrison, the federal judge who had signed the warrants at 12:43 that morning, was unequivocal. The defendant is a flight risk, a danger to witnesses, and has demonstrated willingness to use lethal force to avoid accountability. The discharge of a firearm at a residential complex last night while attempting to access the primary witness confirms that this defendant will escalate violence if released. Bail is denied. Remand to federal custody pending trial. The evidence against Wade Prescott was not a case. It was an avalanche. Bytes financial records, offshore accounts, shell companies, $200,000 in protection payments from a trafficking network. The insurance policy on Grace Dawson, $250,000, filed 5 days before the scheduled murder. Stitch's medical documentation, 23 minutes of photographs and clinical notes that showed in color and in detail what 8 months of violence looked like when written on a woman's body. The testimony of Karen Finley, who had tried to report and been threatened into silence. The testimony of Brenda Holloway, who had tried to listen and been deceived. The testimony of Officer Dale Murdoch, who had seen the truth and followed chain of command instead of conscience. The midnight footage, 7 camera angles of Wade Prescott arriving at Riverside Apartments with a weapon threatening the witness, discharging a firearm. And the crown jewel of the prosecution, the forensic analysis of Diana Sutton's vehicle. The FBI forensic team had examined Diana's car Wednesday evening at the state evidence impound. The brake line showed tool marks, clean cuts, not wear and tear. When they compared those marks to the pipe cutter recovered from Wade's garage, the patterns matched with 97% certainty. Diana Sutton had not died in an accident. Her brake line had been severed deliberately, and the tool that did it was sitting on a workbench that Wade Prescott had built with his own hands. 4 years. For 4 years, Diana's family had known. They had told anyone who would listen that the accident didn't make sense, that Diana was a careful driver, that her car had been serviced 2 weeks before the crash, that the investigation had been closed too quickly by the same man Diana had been dating. No one listened, because the man they were accusing was the police chief. Because authority, when it corrupts, doesn't just commit crimes. It erases the ability of anyone to see those crimes for what they are. Now the evidence was irrefutable. First-degree murder, premeditated, calculated, profitable. Victor Prescott, already in federal prison for trafficking, was offered a deal. Testify against his brother for reduced sentencing. He took it without hesitation, giving prosecutors phone records, meeting locations, exact payment amounts, the names of the children whose disappearances Wade had classified as runaways, in a detailed account of how the brothers had operated together for nearly 5 years. 6 months later, April, spring in Virginia. The trial of Wade James Prescott lasted 11 days. The prosecution called 23 witnesses. The defense called 4. The courtroom was full every day, and every day 50 Hells Angels sat in the gallery, in their leather vests, silent, watching a wall of witnesses who had started as strangers and become the family that Grace Dawson never had. Grace testified on day 4, 3 hours on the stand. The prosecution walked her through the timeline methodically. Meeting Wade, the charm, the isolation, the first grab, the escalation, the recordings, the tooth. The defense attorney, a man named Philip Garrettson, who had been hired with money from Wade's offshore accounts before those accounts were frozen, tried to dismantle her. He was good at his job, polished, expensive, the kind of lawyer who wore suits that cost more than Grace made in a month and spoke with the kind of calm, reasonable authority that was designed to make a jury believe that reasonable people could disagree about whether a woman's bruises were really bruises. Miss Dawson, isn't it true that you continued to see Mr. Prescott voluntarily for 8 months? Garrettson waited. The courtroom waited. Grace looked at the jury, 12 people, ordinary people, people who had never had to explain to a room full of strangers why they didn't leave a man who was systematically destroying them. I continued to live in the same town as the police chief who controlled every institution that could have helped me escape. I continued to eat and breathe and go to work and take care of my son. If that qualifies as seeing him voluntarily, then yes. You never once tried to leave the state. I tried to leave the relationship. He told me he would have my son removed by Child Protective Services. He told me he would file a report saying I was an unfit mother. And he could do it. He had done it before. He was the police chief. CPS would have taken his word over mine without a second thought. You had access to phones, to transportation, to resources. Doesn't that suggest you could have sought help elsewhere? Grace's hands were steady. She had rehearsed this, not the words, the steadiness. Dr. Martinez had taught her that the defense would try to make her doubt herself, to make the jury see uncertainty where there was only the impossible mathematics of survival. I had access to phones that were monitored by the man who ran the department that would receive any call for help. I had access to a car in a town where that same man had officers who could pull me over at any time for any reason and bring me back. I had resources in a community where the nurse who tried to report my injuries was threatened with losing her license, where the counselor who tried to help my son was deceived into closing the case, where the judge who could have granted me a restraining order was the defendant's golfing partner. I didn't stay because I wanted to. I stayed because every exit was guarded by the man I was trying to escape. The courtroom was silent. And yet you found a way to record him, Garrettson pressed. You found a way to hide a phone. You found a way to collect evidence. Doesn't that suggest you had more freedom than you're claiming? Grace's answer would be quoted in newspapers across the country, printed on advocacy posters, referenced in training materials for law enforcement and judicial education programs for years to come. It doesn't suggest freedom, it suggests desperation. When every door is locked and every window is sealed, and every person who should help you has been silenced or bought or threatened, you don't stop trying. You find the smallest crack, the one thing he didn't think to control. For me, it was a $40 prepaid phone hidden in the lining of my winter coat. That's not freedom, that's survival. And the fact that I had to go to those lengths to protect myself and my son is not evidence that I was free. It's evidence of how completely he controlled everything else. Garrettson had no follow-up. He sat down. The jury watched him sit down, and in that small gesture, the surrender of a lawyer who had run out of ways to rewrite the truth, the case turned. Day 7, the forensic testimony. An independent brake line analyst explained in language precise enough for a courtroom and clear enough for 12 civilians how the cuts on Diana Sutton's brake line were made by a specific type of tool, how the pipe cutter from Wade's garage matched those cuts, how the staging of the accident scene was consistent with someone who understood police investigation procedures because he had conducted hundreds of them. Day 9. Victor Prescott testified via video from federal prison. He described the operation, the foster care placements approved by Judge Fleming, the children removed from families on false pretenses, the fake death certificates, the transport to buyers, and his brother's role in all of it. Wade made sure nobody investigated. He closed missing persons cases within 72 hours, classified every disappearance as a runaway, destroyed any report that came too close. He was paid $12,500 every quarter. He never missed a payment. He never asked about the children. He just made sure nobody looked. Day 11, closing arguments. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named Lawrence Holt, stood before the jury and held up a small evidence bag. Inside was a gold tooth, a gold crown with a ragged root cleaned of blood, tagged and cataloged evidence item number 1 in a case that began when a 10-year-old boy walked 3 miles in the rain to ask a stranger for help. This tooth, Holt said, was knocked from Grace Dawson's mouth by the defendant on November 10th. Her 10-year-old son picked it up off the floor. His mother told him to keep it, that it was evidence, that if something happened to her, he should take it to someone who could help. That boy carried this tooth to a pawn shop and placed it on a counter and asked if it could buy protection. He was willing to go to prison. He was willing to sacrifice his childhood because every adult and every institution in his life had failed him and his mother. Holt set the evidence bag down. The defendant didn't just assault Grace Dawson. He didn't just murder Diana Sutton. He didn't just profit from the trafficking of children. He dismantled every system designed to protect the vulnerable and rebuilt those systems to serve himself. He turned police into accomplices. He turned judges into co-conspirators. He turned hospitals into dead ends. He turned a woman's life into a commodity worth $250,000. The jury deliberated for 87 minutes. In those 87 minutes, Grace sat in the gallery and tried to breathe. Rattler was on her left, Agent Rhodes on her right, behind her 50 Hells Angels in leather vests. Karen and Brenda sat 3 rows back. Officer Murdoch stood against the wall in his dress uniform badge, polished like a man making a statement about what that badge should mean. 87 minutes. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Long enough for Grace to wonder whether a jury of 12 strangers could understand what it meant to live inside the machine that Wade had built. Whether they could see past the defense attorney's questions about why she didn't leave, why she didn't fight, why she didn't do all the things that people who have never been trapped always think they would do. The door to the deliberation room opened. The 4 women stood. The judge asked the question that every trial builds toward. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of felony assault, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the charge of attempted homicide by strangulation? Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking? Guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice? Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Diana Sutton? Guilty. Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the courtroom. 5 counts. 5 times the word guilty rang off the walls. 5 times Wade Prescott's carefully constructed life collapsed by another degree. When the 4th woman finished, Grace Dawson sat in the front row of the gallery and felt something leave her body. Not a sound, not tears, something heavier. The weight of 8 months of terror, of silence, of sleeping with one eye open and flinching at shadows and wondering whether Thursday would be the last day of her life. It left her all at once, like a held breath, finally released, and what remained was not emptiness, but space. Space to breathe, space to live, space to be something other than afraid. She turned around, looked at the gallery. 50 Hells Angels, Rattler in the front row, Bison beside him, Stitch, Bite, Prophet, Karen Finley, Brenda Holloway, Officer Murdoch, Agent Rhodes. All of them there, all of them keeping the promise that had been made in a pawn shop 48 hours before the world changed. Grace mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Sentencing came 3 weeks later. The judge was direct. Mr. Prescott, you betrayed every oath you took. You weaponized authority that was meant to protect into an instrument of destruction. You ended one woman's life and attempted to end another's. You profited from the trafficking of children. You corrupted every institution that was meant to pursue justice. Society will never be safe with you in it. You will never be free again. Life in federal prison, without possibility of parole. Wade Prescott stood when the sentence was read. For a moment, the mask came back, the composed, authoritative expression of a man who had spent his career projecting control. Then it cracked, just for a second, just long enough for Grace, watching from the gallery, to see the face beneath it. Not anger, not defiance, fear. The same fear he had put into her for 8 months. The same fear he had put into Diana Sutton before he cut her brake line. The same fear he had put into 6 families whose children had vanished into a system he controlled. Now it was his. Now it would be his for every day of every year for the rest of his life. The marshals took him. The courtroom door closed, and Wade Prescott passed from the world of free men into the world he had built for others. A cage with no exit, a life controlled by someone else's authority. A future defined by walls and schedules in the absolute irrevocable absence of power. Victor Prescott, 40 years. Cooperation had reduced his sentence from life, but at 62 years old, it was a distinction without a difference. He would die behind bars surrounded by the same concrete and fluorescent light that his victims had been trapped in before being sold. Judge Harold Fleming, 10 years federal, disbarred permanently, pension revoked. The golf buddy who had denied a restraining order and signed foster care placements for children who would be sold. His wife filed for divorce the day after sentencing. His children changed their last name. The aftermath unfolded the way water finds its path after a dam breaks. Slowly at first, then all at once. Rattler drove Grace and Ethan to the safe house in Richmond on the day of the arrest. A 2-bedroom apartment, clean and anonymous, paid for by federal witness protection funds. Grace stood in the doorway and stared at the empty rooms like someone who has just arrived in a country she has only read about. "Nothing's wrong," she whispered. "For the first time in 8 months, nothing's wrong. He doesn't know where I am. He can't get to me. He can't hurt Ethan. This is what safe feels like." I forgot. The brothers showed up exactly when they said they would, not just for the dramatic moments, for the quiet ones. Stitch accompanied Grace to her medical appointments, 2 broken ribs improperly healed. A dental appointment arranged by Karen Finley, who had called in a favor from a surgeon she knew and covered the cost herself. The new tooth was ceramic, not gold, stronger, permanent, but the original gold tooth, the one Ethan had carried, the one that became evidence. Agent Rhodes returned it after the trial. Evidence no longer needed. "Thought you might want it back," Rhodes said. Grace held the small gold crown in her palm. "Cleaned of blood now. Just metal, just proof." "What should I do with it?" "Keep it," Rattler said. "Remember what you survived. Remember that you're stronger than what tried to break you." Bison arranged a job for Grace. Ironclad Construction, a legitimate business owned by the Virginia chapter. They needed an office manager, someone organized, detail-oriented, someone who had managed diner rushes and inventory and health inspections and double shifts for 8 years. "I've never done office work," Grace said. "You've run a restaurant floor during a Saturday night dinner rush," Bison replied. "You've handled difficult customers, balanced registers, managed schedules, and kept your head while everything around you was chaos. That's exactly the skill set we need. $47,000 a year, health insurance, paid time off, start Monday." Grace stared at him. $47,000, more than she had ever made working 2 jobs simultaneously, more than she thought she was worth, because 8 months of Wade Prescott had taught her that she was worth nothing, and undoing that lesson would take longer than any trial. She took the job. Monday morning, her first day. She stood in the parking lot of Ironclad Construction for 3 full minutes before going inside. Not because she was afraid, because she was trying to memorize the feeling. The feeling of walking into a building where no one was going to hurt her, where her value was measured in what she could do, not in what she could endure. An office with a window, a real window with sunlight, a desk with a placard that read, "Grace Dawson, Office Manager." Her coworker, Michelle Prophet's daughter, helped her learn the systems. Scheduling, invoices, payroll, the ordinary machinery of a business that built things instead of destroying them. By the end of the first week, Grace was handling it like she had been doing it for years, because she had been. Different context, same skills. Managing a diner floor during rush hour required the same organizational instincts as managing a construction office. The difference was that nobody at Ironclad Construction was going to grab her arm if she smiled at the wrong person. "I'm not scared here," Grace told Michelle on the 3rd day. "I forgot what it's like to go to work and not be afraid." Ethan enrolled at Richmond Heights Elementary. Fresh start, no history, no teachers who had seen him afraid, no counselors who had failed him. On his first day, Bite drove him to school, walked him to the front office. The school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Okonkwo, 54 years old, 26 years in education, knelt to Ethan's level. "Ethan, I know you've been through a lot. Your advocate told me some of what happened. I want you to know something, and I want you to remember it. If you ever need to talk, my door is always open. And if you tell me something scary, I will believe you. I will act. I will not make you prove it. I will not call your mother to check. I will believe you first and investigate second. Understand? Ethan looked at Bite. Bite nodded. This one's different. This one's safe. Okay, Ethan said quietly. New friends within 2 weeks. Chess club within a month. His teacher, Mr. Marcus Williams, noticed something in Ethan that would define the boy for years to come. He's protective. Stands up for other kids who are being picked on. Like he knows what it's like to need someone in your corner. Ironside, the ex-Army Ranger, taught Ethan self-defense on Saturday mornings at the clubhouse. Not violence. Awareness. The loudest weapon you have is your voice, Ironside told him. Someone makes you uncomfortable, you yell. You run, you tell adults, and if adults don't listen, you keep telling until someone does. What if I'm too scared to yell? Then we practice right now. Show me your scared voice. Ethan whispered, help. Louder. Help. Louder. Like you mean it. Like you deserve to be saved. Ethan took a deep breath and screamed, help. Somebody help me. 5 brothers stopped what they were doing. Came running. Ready. Ironside grinned. See, they came. They'll always come. Now you know your voice works. Grace went to therapy every Tuesday. Dr. Linda Martinez, trauma specialist. The work was slow and hard and nonlinear. Some weeks, Grace felt strong enough to carry anything. Other weeks, a door slamming in the office sent her heart rate to 160, and she had to sit in the bathroom for 10 minutes with her hands pressed against the cool tile, breathing, reminding herself that the war was over. Your body learned to survive a war zone, Dr. Martinez told her. It's still in protection mode. We're teaching it that the war is over. That takes time. By month 3, Grace could sleep through the night. By month 4, she could hear a man shout construction workers arguing about football scores in the break room without flinching. Small victories, but victories. 3 months after the trial, the Ashford Springs Police Department launched the Angels Watch program, a direct hotline for domestic violence that bypassed local police and connected directly to state authorities. Independent oversight of all domestic violence cases, mandatory body cameras for wellness checks, training for officers on recognizing when chain of command is compromised. The program was named after the Hells Angels, after the men who showed up when the system didn't. Officer Dale Murdoch ran it. He had kept his badge, but he had changed what that badge meant. I followed orders before he said at the program's launch. Now I follow conscience. If I see something wrong, I report it, even if it cost me my career. Because keeping this career isn't worth failing another Grace Dawson. Within a year, 23 police departments in Virginia had adopted the program. Domestic violence prosecution rates in those jurisdictions increased by 34%. Victim cooperation increased by 41%. Reoffending rates dropped 28%. The numbers told a story of their own, that when the system is redesigned to protect victims instead of perpetrators, victims respond by trusting the system. When officers are trained to recognize that their own chain of command can be weaponized against the people they serve, they become better officers. When independent oversight exists, corruption has fewer shadows to hide in. It wasn't perfect. No system built by humans ever is. But it was better. And better for the Graces and the Dianas who came after was the difference between life and death. Rattler visited Ethan every other Saturday, took him fishing at a lake outside Richmond, taught him how to tie knots and read water, and be patient in the way that fishing demands the same patience that had kept Rattler alive in Ramadi and functional through 16 years of grief. On one of those Saturdays, sitting on the bank with their lines in the water and the autumn light turning the lake to copper, Ethan asked the question that had been forming in him for months. Do you think your sister would be proud of you? Rattler was quiet for a long time, long enough for a fish to take Ethan's bait and for the boy to reel it in a small bass and throw it back. I think she'd be glad someone else got saved, Rattler said finally. That's all she ever wanted, for people to be safe. 6 months after the trial, a Saturday in October, the Virginia chapter threw a gathering at a community park in Richmond, picnic tables, a playground, families, grills sending smoke into the autumn air. Ethan ran across the grass chasing a soccer ball with 3 other kids. He was laughing. The kind of free, unself-conscious laughter that 11-year-olds are supposed to have, but that Ethan had lost somewhere in the violence and found again in the months since. He was wearing a new jacket, the Hells Angels patch pinned to his backpack, which hung from a tree branch nearby. Grace stood at a picnic table with Michelle Karen Finley and Brenda Holloway, 4 women connected by guilt and failure 6 months ago. now connected by something else. Friendship, second chances, the slow, complicated work of forgiving themselves and each other. How's the new tooth, Karen asked. Grace smiled, a full smile. No gap. Perfect. Thank you again. How's Ethan, Brenda asked. Honor roll, Grace said, and the pride in her voice was the pride of a woman who had crawled through 8 months of destruction and come out the other side holding her son's hand. Chess team, friends, sleeps through the night. And you, Grace paused. Considered the question the way you consider something that used to have only one answer and now has many. I'm better. Still in therapy, still have hard days, but I'm not afraid anymore. I go to work and it's just work. I come home and it's just home. I'm studying for my GED 3 nights a week. My education got interrupted by surviving, but I'm taking it back. Community college next year maybe. Business management. Maybe own my own company someday. She paused and the next words came out quiet but firm. I spent 8 months believing I was worth nothing. I'm spending the rest of my life proving that wrong. Not to Wade, he doesn't matter anymore. To myself and to Ethan. So he knows that what happened to us doesn't define us. What we did after defines us. And even if something happened, even if some new danger appeared, I know. She gestured at the 50 men scattered across the park, grilling burgers, playing cornhole, teaching kids to throw footballs. I know they'd come. I'm not alone, that's the difference. That's everything. Rattler walked over from the grill. Burgers are ready. Who wants cheese? Me. Ethan ran up breathless. Rattler handed him a plate, ruffled his hair. Still wearing that patch, I see. Every day. Good. Don't forget what it means. You're protected. You're family. And if you ever need help, not just now, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you call. We come. That's what brotherhood means. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then with the directness that only children have the willingness to ask the question that adults spend their lives avoiding. Rattler, why did you really help us? I know you said it's because of your sister, but there are lots of people who need help. Why us? Rattler was quiet for a long time. The park sounds filled the space between them. Children playing. The crack of a football hitting someone's hands. The low rumble of conversation from men who had ridden through storms together and were now eating cheeseburgers on a Saturday afternoon. Then he knelt down, the same way he had in the pawn shop 6 months ago. Eye level, man to boy. You know what you taught me, Ethan? You taught me that I can't save Jolene. She's gone. I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But I can save someone else's sister, someone else's mom, someone else's kid who's desperate and out of options. You walked into my shop and asked me for a weapon, and I realized you weren't really asking for a gun. You were asking me to be the adult who finally didn't fail you. And that's something I can do. That's something I can be. Ethan hugged him. This 11-year-old boy and this 6'2" biker with the gray beard and the scars and the leather vest standing in a park on a Saturday afternoon, holding on to each other like two people who had found the thing they were looking for in the last place they expected. Later, as the sun set and the park emptied and families packed up their gear, Grace found Rattler sitting alone on a bench watching the October light fade. She sat next to him, pulled something from her bag. Rattler reached into his own pocket, pulled out a small shadow box, 4 inches square, glass front. Inside, mounted on black velvet, was the gold tooth, cleaned and gleaming. Beneath it, a small engraved plate, evidence that saved 2 lives. November 12, 2024. Courage comes in small hands. I had this made, Rattler said. Thought you might want it. A reminder of what you survived, what Ethan did, what happened when one child refused to give up. Grace took the shadow box, held it up to the fading light. The gold crown caught the last of the October sun and threw it back in a small, warm flash. She thought about that Tuesday afternoon, about Ethan unwrapping this tooth on a pawn shop counter, about how a piece of evidence born from violence had become a symbol of rescue. I'll keep it on my desk at work, Grace said. So when I have hard days, I can look at it and remember. I survived, we survived, and we're not alone anymore. Rattler nodded. Then he said the thing he had been carrying since the day he opened that thin envelope in Ramadi. Jolene never got to see justice. She never got to heal. She never got to build a life after the violence. But you did. And every time I see you thriving, every time I see Ethan laughing, I think this is what Jolene would have wanted. Not revenge, not hatred, just for other people to be saved, for other families to survive, for the ending to be different. The ending is different, Grace said quietly, because you made it different. The park was nearly empty now. The last light was fading behind the Virginia hills. Somewhere in a federal prison with no windows facing west, Wade Prescott was learning what it meant to be powerless for the first time in his life. Somewhere, 6 children who had been stolen from foster homes were being found one by one through the evidence and testimony that Grace's recordings had made possible. 3 had already been returned to families. The other 3 were in the process. It was slow, it was painful, but it was happening. And here in a park in Richmond, a woman who had been told she was worth nothing was sitting on a bench with a gold tooth and a shadow box and a wall, and a son who was laughing, and friends who had come from the strangest and most unexpected corners of the world. She was alive. She was safe. She was rebuilding. Not the life she had before, because that life had been built on quicksand. A better one. A life with a foundation poured from concrete and rebar, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't dissolve when things get hard. Grace Dawson stood up, tucked the shadow box into her bag, walked across the grass to collect Ethan, who was helping Bison fold up the last of the picnic chairs. "Ready to go home, Mom?" "Yeah, baby. Ready to go home." They walked to the car together, Grace's hand on Ethan's shoulder, the patch on his backpack catching the streetlight as they moved from the park to the parking lot. Behind them, Rattler sat on the bench and watched them go. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. They were safe. They were whole. They were going home. And that was enough. After 16 years of guilt, in a closed casket, in a photo carried in a wallet across oceans and deserts, in the long, empty roads of a life spent looking for redemption, watching Grace Dawson walk to her car with her son under the October stars was enough. Back in Ashford Springs, the pawn shop still stood on the corner of Main and 4th. Rattler still opened it every morning at 9. But now there was a sign in the window hand-painted in white letters on blackboard. "If you need help, ask. We connect people to resources. No judgment, no questions. Just help." 3 times in the past year, someone desperate had walked through that door. Not all of them children. Not all of them carrying gold teeth. But all of them carrying the same thing Ethan had carried that Tuesday afternoon in November. The unbearable weight of a problem too big for one person. The hope thin as thread but strong as wire that asking one more time might finally reach someone who would listen. Rattler made the same call every time. Agent at roads, shelter services, protection detail if needed, because that's what it meant to be the last line. To be the door that opens when every other door is closed. Not because it erased Jolene, nothing erased Jolene, but because it proved that the story doesn't always end the same way. That sometimes the door opens instead of closing. That sometimes the person who shows up is the right person at the right moment with the right amount of stubborn, inconvenient, leather-vested courage. That sometimes a bloody gold tooth on a pawn shop counter is not the end of a story, but the beginning of one. And somewhere years from now, when Ethan Dawson tells this story and he will tell it, he won't start with the violence. He won't start with the fear. He'll start with a Tuesday afternoon in November, with walking 3 miles in the rain, with unwrapping a bloody gold tooth on a counter and asking a question that sounded like desperation, but was actually hope. Can this buy protection? And the answer that changed everything was yes. Not because gold can buy weapons, but because asking for help from the right person can buy everything. Because brotherhood isn't about blood or patches or motorcycles. It's about showing up when someone needs you. Even if they're a stranger, even if it's inconvenient, even if nobody's watching, especially if nobody's watching.